Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History YouTube channel. This is a kind of a special sort of thing I'm doing, primarily because of what is about to happen tomorrow. So, if you watch this YouTube channel from anywhere around the world, you might be forgiven for slightly underestimating the likelihood of change in Britain tomorrow. Something very, very consequential is about to happen in the history of British politics. And I think this has huge implications for where we stand in not just a kind of a national British context, but around the world. When we look at how so notionally democratic right-wing capitalist political parties function and are elected. Tomorrow, there will be a general election in Great Britain, but it will not be any ordinary general election. Tomorrow, if all the polls are correct, a political earthquake of unprecedented proportions is going to happen. You can check in on this video in 24 or 48 hours time. I might be completely wrong, and you can put the comments down below and have a good laugh at my expense. That's fine. But all the polls suggest something monumental is about to happen. The Conservative Party in Great Britain, the most successful political party in the democratic world for over the last 2 centuries, is about to be obliterated. It will be lucky to get over 100 seats. Bear in mind, in the British Parliament there are 650 seats, and you need obviously over 325 to form an overall majority. In Great Britain, we have a first-past-the-post electoral system. We don't have a proportional representation. Coalitions are very, very rare, very, very unlikely to happen, and it looks like the British Labour Party will form an overall majority of epic proportion. Why does this matter? Why is this significant? Well, as I said, about 200 years of British political history is about to implode tomorrow. And in order to understand why this is significant, why this is important, and why this matters, we kind of need to look at what the Conservative Party is. Okay, there is probably in every democratic country in the world a version of the Conservative Party. It is the party of wealth, it is the party of capital, and it is the party that tirelessly works to ensure that wealth is as undemocratized as possible. There have been moments in the past with the Conservative Party where it has been forced under the kind of the tides of political influence and sort of social change, where it's been forced to be slightly more egalitarian, but for the most part it has been a party firstly of landowners, then industrialists, and then finance, okay, in that order chronologically. So the Conservative Party, the modern Conservative Party, kind of emerges in around the 1840s, which the reason for that is in 1832 there was a Political Reform Act in Britain, which meant that for the first time, basically in very, very crude sort of terms, for the first time the middle classes in Britain were able to exercise the vote and access political power. So previously the Parliament was a kind of a gentleman's club for the aristocracy, for the landed gentry, and it served the interests of the landed gentry. Now you have in the 19th century a rapidly industrialising country that meant that there was a rising class of industrialists and kind of like a middle class of bourgeoisie that coalesce around that, of all the people, the kind of the skilled white collar labour that you need to make industry work. The lawyers, the engineers, the doctors that were responsible for developing public health and that kind of thing. But you're far away from moving towards a kind of like a more mass democracy by incorporating elements of the working class. That happens in 1867 and it happens in 1883. There are 2 Reform Acts that bring the working classes in. There's a third one the fourth one, in 1918, and another one in 1927. And by 1927 is the only time in which you can really start talking about Britain as being a mass democracy where all adult men and women are, with certain exemptions, are able to vote. So less than 100 years ago. The thing that the Conservative Party always did throughout this period is it always knew the right moment to reinvent itself. In the 1860s, you see the beginnings of the development of a thing called one nation conservatism. The idea that the Conservative Party, which is there once again to represent industry and to some degree the agricultural landed gentry, look to the fact that unless you want a revolution in the country, you're going to have to extend the franchise to elements of the working class, the kind of the artisan working class, the skilled workers who have some education, who have some stake in the kind of in wider society, who have skills and trades, people like kind of engineers and boilermakers, and the people who were the more skilled workers in building the railways and that kind of thing. And then in 1883, you are looking at the development of a mass working class franchise, extending that to unskilled workers. Even by the dawn of the First World War, 1914, 40% of the British working class still didn't have the vote. So by no means was everybody enfranchised after 1883. But each and every time, the Conservative Party learned how to appeal to new constituents. It did so in the 1860s onwards by developing a kind of a patriotic one nation conservatism that appealed to enough of the working classes to incorporate them into the political system and to look favourably on the Conservatives. Though, in fact, actually, the election following the 1887 Reform Act, the Conservatives actually lose that. But over time, the long trend of conservatism has been to be in power. In the 20th century, the big changes, the kind of the enfranchisement of women benefited the Conservative. If women hadn't had the vote in the 20th century, the Conservative Party wouldn't have won a single general election. Okay. So the Conservatives knew how to speak to a section of the aspirant middle class and lower middle class and even upper working class female electorate. And they talked about aspiration, they talked about family values, they talked about the kind of a sort of a kind of an individualism that you later see articulated by Margaret Thatcher, the idea to get ahead, and that part of that is about home ownership and property and prudence and saving and all these kind of slightly sort of Victorian values of self-help. And it was very useful in driving a wedge between middle and working classes. A holdover from the 19th century was this idea that if you're working class, then your route out of poverty is through hard work and thrift and abstain drink. And this was music to many middle class ears, that if the lower orders can't kind of manage their behaviour and as a result they sink into poverty and deprivation, it's sort of their fault, and therefore we don't need to, for example, pay lots of money into into taxation and therefore into kind of transfers of wealth by social welfare. Very kind of an article of faith of conservatism even now. So in the 20th century, you have, for 2/3 of the 20th century, the Conservatives have been in power. The moments where they haven't been in power have been huge existential shocks to the Tory party, because part of the kind of the Tory worldview is that there's no really need for anyone else to be in power ever, really. And this is, again, a common sentiment among large numbers of Tory voters. So, would you want anybody else? This is the sensible one nation party that just does all the right things to make sure that kind of things are neatly managed. Good. And of course that's wildly undemocratic, but in mass democracies with large numbers of people think fairly routinely in fundamentally undemocratic ways. It's hardly a rare or kind of unexpected thing. In the After 1945, the Conservative Party accepted fairly quickly, within 2 or 3 years, that the ideas of the Labour Party after the Second World War would be essentially hegemonic for a generation. Those ideas were a commitment to full employment, the idea, you've gone through the Great Depression before the war, and therefore mass unemployment is now completely unacceptable. The idea that the state has a huge role to play in the organisation of society. The mobilisation of state and society had won the Second World War, and without that, chances are Britain would have lost. The idea that the unions have a significant role to play in the management of the economy. There is this kind of new period of consensus and cooperation between the government and the unions, and Labour. The Labour Party, whilst being largely the product of the unions, was still exceedingly wary of union power. There is often this kind of myth talked about the Labour Party that they're in cahoots with the unions. Well, not really, and Labour politicians have fallen foul of union militancy and protest in a number of ways. So the final idea was that there would be a welfare state. And this was dreamt up by the liberal civil servant, later peer, William Beveridge, during the Second World War. The idea that there should be some kind of cradle-to-grave provision of services for all citizens, including a national health service, access to education, old age pensions, and a host of other kind of municipal rights in housing. These are anathemas to the Conservative mentality. The way that the Conservative Party viewed things was that a degree of inequality is essential, it is natural, and to some extent it's desirable, and that the idea that the unions, that organised labour, should be able to dictate, in their view, government policies is terrible as well, and that unemployment, while that it's in the kind of the model of classical economics, not the government's role to regulate the market or to regulate labour markets or regulate the workings of capitalism. And if you do that, you actually create further crises down the road. In the 1950s, a small number of conservatives, including Enoch Powell, who we should talk about later, rebelled against the Macmillan government, protesting that the move towards a kind of a consensus with the Labour Party on a mixed economy with an element of social welfare and social democracy on this. This was the kind of the rot that would destroy the country. The Conservatives in 1947 created a document called the Industrial Charter, which essentially was waving the white flag. The Industrial Charter was not something that they wanted to have to sign. It's not something that they wanted to create. They ideally didn't want this at all, but they feel they have to. There's no other choice because of the popularity of Labour's victory, the size of Labour's victory in 1945, and the popularity of Labour's measures, including the development of the NHS, the Industrial Charter essentially says that we accept that the political situation is such that we cannot do anything else. We are constrained, and we must kind of stick to this kind of consensus ground. That the political consensus has moved to the left. In the context of the Cold War as well, which perhaps we forget now how mindful our political classes were in 1945 of the success of the Soviet Union and the spread of Stalinism, and after 1949 also the fact that China falls to communism. So in the post-war era, there was a sense that there would be a return to the upheavals of the interwar years, or possibly even worse, that the threats that democracy and capitalism had been subjected to since 1917 all the way up to 1945 might overwhelm liberal democracies in the Western world, and in this case, Great Britain, unless some kind of social compact is reached. And you see this emerging in almost every major first world country. The New Deal in America lasts until the mid 1960s, so well, actually, arguably up until 1980 when Reagan began to dismantle it. The various models of welfare statism that existed in Europe after the Second World War was specifically for the purpose, in a continent that had just experienced fascism, was under the threat of communism, for keeping all that at bay. And when you get to the end of the Cold War, all of a sudden the collapse in the Soviet threat ushers in a decade of kind of turbo-powered neoliberalism, of explosion of kind of market power, as the power of labour around the world kind of dwindles, and the fact that you get, during globalisation, millions and millions of new workers entering the global system, particularly in the case of China, meant that the power of labour internationally was diluted. And so, particularly in first world countries, labour movements and social democratic parties have really, really struggled. And we'll come on to that a little bit later. But I suppose, in order to understand why the Conservative Party is about to collapse tomorrow, it's instructive to kind of try to understand a little bit about what the Conservative Party has always believed. What does this term conservatism mean? What are they trying to conserve? Well, they're trying to, the whole point of conservatism, which emerged as a kind of byproduct of the French Revolution, is to try to create a kind of a firebreak against modernity. This has changed over the years, but it's been about keeping back the waves of radical change that have swept the world since the late 18th century. That's, this is how far back we're going as the Conservative Party, or the idea of conservatism. The thinkers who theorized the basic premises of conservatism, one being the Anglo-Irish philosopher Edmund Burke, looked at the French Revolution and said, that's not attractive, it's not desirable, you don't want that. The humanity, the basic kind of condition of humanity is bad. Human beings are, the dangerous beasts, and you have to kind of constrain them. You can't have them kind of smashing into everything and causing anarchy. And the idea that ordinary men might be able to have a role in politics, this is preposterous. This is, the world turned upside down. This is sort of a dreadful prospect, and you can't have it. And when the French Revolutionary Terror happens in 1792, this vindicates what Burke was saying. He said, look, there you go. That's where revolutions lead. And there is more than a kind of a grain of truth in that. Revolutions aren't nice. They're not done by nice people, and they very rarely have wonderful, cuddly outcomes. There is a lot of suffering and bloodshed. Doesn't mean to say that from time to time they're not required, but you have to be very, very circumspect about these sorts of things. The thing about conservatism in the 19th and 20th centuries, though, is it has really been about the preservation of class and privilege. And the great political skill of conservatism is about preserving class and privilege in an age of mass democracy. How do you do that? How do you convince people in an age where there are increasing levels of education, increasing levels of political empowerment, and increasing levels of political awareness, that ultimately voting for the status quo is a kind of a worthwhile endeavour? Well, the Conservative Party has been aided throughout the 20th century consistently by the mass media. If you look at the media barons, people such as Lord Beaverbrook, who were friends with men like Winston Churchill, all the way through to Rupert Murdoch in the from the 1960s onwards. They have favoured the Conservative Party. There's been a brief interest in the Labour Party under Tony Blair and things like that, when you've had moments where the Labour Party has shifted to the right. But ultimately, the Conservative Party has been aided by the media and by the other small c conservative organs of state, the institutions of state. It also seeks to conserve things like the Lords, the judiciary, the army, the police, the civil service, all this kind of stuff. When you get to 1979 in Margaret Thatcher, you've had throughout the post-war era, you've had the following Conservative prime ministers. You've had Churchill, Eden, Macmillan, Hume. You've had Heath, and then finally you get Thatcher. In the meantime, there have been two Labour prime ministers, Attlee and Wilson, and Callaghan. Three. And so that gives you a clue about actual Conservative successors throughout the post-war era. The Conservatives had been forced throughout that period of time to essentially adopt most of the Labour's agenda, but had it still been electorally more successful. Labour had some transformative governments, but ultimately it was the Conservatives that were in power most often. Margaret Thatcher comes to power in 1979 under a kind of after a decade of that most British people sort of popularly see as a decade of crisis. See it as a decade whereby Britain was in a sort of permanent set of social crises due to inflation and union strike action. And also there was a sense amongst sort of the conservative voting middle classes that kind of progressive politics and progressive ideas had gone too far, and enough was enough. There was a sense that we are taking this country back, and there was a wide range of kind of activism amongst the Conservatives, the wider conservative movement, that and these sort of rather kind of wild ideas that sort of Harold Wilson was a communist and things like that, which is nonsensical idea. Wilson was a moderately right of centre Labour leader who loved all things with a Union Jack on them, was fiercely patriotic, and had a very good relationship with the Queen. Not a revolutionary figure at all, but this kind of political language gets thrown around in these ridiculous ways quite regularly. So in 1979, Thatcher comes to power with a contradictory bundle of ideas. She comes to power firstly with the idea that the country needs to be transformed with a kind of an economic shock therapy that we'll talk about in a moment. This kind of idea that gets talked about an awful lot, neoliberalism, this economic idea that was at the time described as monetarism. It's about restricting the money supply in the economy to bring down inflation. And gradually, as Margaret Thatcher's time in office went on, more and more iterations of neoliberalism are introduced, and Margaret Thatcher begins to radically transform society. So things such as council house sales, the privatisations, the cuts to support of local government, and the idea that the commitment to full employment is now no longer something that the government will support. Margaret Thatcher had, I think, is often less informed by the kind of the ideas of neoliberal thinkers like Friedrich von Hayek, who she famously waved around his book, The Constitution of Liberty, and said, "This is what we believe." I think she's less informed by that and more informed by something even more banal, if you will. She's more informed by the idea that this kind of Victorian idea that charity should be a choice, and that kind of almost like a Christian morality to give alms to the poor should be the choice of people with money. That you shouldn't be kind of extorted from you by these dreadful things called taxes. No, 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 no. It should be something that you choose to do, and that all good people will choose to do it, and that society will function nicely by that. You'll always have poor people, you'll always have destitute people, and you'll always have kindly, essentially good Christians who will give. Um, and I think these were genuinely held beliefs by her, no matter how absurd they might sound. The effect that neoliberal economics has on a society is basically always kind of socially transformative in one way or another. When you remove social safety nets, it causes social problems. But also, when you encourage a society that is based on this idea of opportunity, entrepreneurialism, it means sometimes, if you're a conservative of the old order, that the wrong sort of people wind up with money. You know, the nouveau riche. There are these social transitions that you wind up with. You know, these horrible millionaire pop stars and things like that. That society itself begins to fundamentally change. This is actually an anathema to conservatism, and this will bring us to the kind of the crisis moment that we're in at the moment. But conservatism is there, as said previously, to discourage radical change, not just political change, but social, cultural change. And once you create a world of choice, a world of consumers, where consumers, the logic of the consumer is whatever it is, whether it is kind of reading Chaucer or listening to Public Enemy, the market is never wrong. This is at odds with a fixed and sort of sometimes rural and sometimes bucolic and sometimes institutional view of Britain, or England, really, which is what we're talking about. And so you wind up with conservatism as this kind of coalition between neoliberalism and traditional conservatism. And it only works as long as everyone is enriched by it. And the moment that stops working, and this kind of explodes in 2008, you have an entirely different iteration of conservatism emerging. So, to prevent this video from going on for hours on end, in the post-2008 world is coming to something of a crossroads right now. So, in 2008, the basic promises of neoliberalism, the expanding wealth through the kind of the exercising of market power, ceases to function. You have this the deregulation of the financial sector in America, in Britain, and other places results in this epic world crisis, and a lot of what had been promised turns out to be a bit of a sham. So, the kind of conservatism that emerges in 2010, Conservatives couldn't win a majority then. They didn't have a mandate for what they did. Was the conservatism of austerity. So instead of saying, here we have this wonderful engine that drives prosperity forever and ever and ever, and we're off to the sunless uplands for all time, instead you have a world of diminished circumstances, a world in which you have to say, there are good people and bad people. The market we exist in and the society we exist in is a great sifting mechanism. It shows who's good, it shows who's bad. And guess what? It's the poor that are bad. The poor who are lazy, feckless scroungers. This is an idea that goes back, to the Tudors almost. This goes back to the poor laws. But it's an idea certainly that was very prevalent in the 19th century, that the best way to help the poor is to stop helping them, is to kind of withdraw support from them, because it just leads to entitlement. And in the kind of the Cameron Osborne austerity years, the discipline of the government on poverty, on welfare, has led to an epic number of deaths. I mean, some figures put it by 2019 alone at 335,000 austerity deaths. And so one can only imagine what they are now. In 2015, David Cameron, as we know, wins the majority you didn't expect to win. And to hold his party together of Eurosceptics, and Euroscepticism is perhaps something for another video, and sort of modern centrist neoliberals, he has to hold a fateful referendum, which, to say it has destroyed the country is not far off. The results of Brexit have impoverished Britain. They have caused years and years and years of political chaos, eight years of political chaos. There have been 5 prime ministers, and it has emboldened the far right. The far right that had been a fringe movement, people like Nigel Farage of UKIP, were a kind of a nonsense movement in the 1990s, and a combination of the opportunities handed to him by David Cameron, the support of the right-wing press, and various shady practices. I don't, for one, necessarily put everything down to Russian interference, but I do suspect there's been a fair old bit of that. Has led to a resurgence of the far right. So you have the Labour Party. I'll do another video on them once they're actually in power again. Obviously, the Labour Party has its radical moment in 2015, the election of Jeremy Corbyn. The Labour moves to the left, and this was a reaction against austerity. When Jeremy Corbyn nearly won in 2017, there has to be a concerted state action by less the Tories, more the right of the Labour Party and the press, to destroy the Corbyn movement, because it was thought, well, we'll lose in 2017, we'll take our party back. There'll be two years of embarrassment for us, but we'll take it back. Thought the right of the party, and the fact that they see it as their party is very telling. Anyway, the Labour Party has revived itself in the last 5 years. Purely, it has an epic defeat in 2019, right? Purely by moving to the right, by appeasing conservative voters who vote for conservatism, actual conservatism. They vote for what they view as being their kind of brand of common sense politics. Even if you kind of ignore the basic sadisms that go with conservatism and their kind of brutal treatment of the poor, lots of people in primarily English voters view conservatism as a sort of political common sense, and maybe that's the extent to which they particularly care about politics, because you have to remember probably a majority of the population, kind of for the most part, want politics to sort of go away and stop bothering them. We've reached a point in Britain, because of Thatcherism, because of privatisation, where, for example, the water companies are owned by private equity companies in New York and Abu Dhabi and Hong Kong and places like that. And so our rivers are full of shit and nothing works. We've reached a point where the NHS, long the target of the Conservative Party, it has been pushed to breaking point, and public services have kind of are on the verge of collapse. The austerity years saw local authorities underfunded to the point where some of them are going bankrupt, and the kind of marketisation of universities has had a very, very similar result. So we are at a point now. The reason why the Conservatives face wipeout tomorrow is partly to do with I say the failure of Brexit, but the Brexit wasn't anything that could have succeeded anyway. So it sets up this false premise that there was some wonderful version of Brexit that would have worked. It's not possible. But also the power that the thing that powered Margaret Thatcher to 3 electoral successes was the fact that she was able to essentially sell public infrastructure. There's nothing left to sell. Thatcherism, the success of Thatcherism, was a one-time only deal. Tony Blair inherited some very, very fortuitous world circumstances, just when kind of globalization was at its peak. And now we are at a point where we're on the kind of like the downward slope of globalization. Some economists argue that we're in kind of deglobalization, the fracturing of globalization. So there are none of those attractive circumstances, and you have a kind of an angrier, more insular, more kind of fearful general population that are looking, with great trepidation and worry about the future, with some justification. But also a Labour Party that has tacked to the right enough that paradoxically, when change is hugely needed, they're actually winning votes by promising as little of it as possible. Part of the reason why they're doing this, I suspect, is that the focus groups are telling them that promises of change poll very, very badly with people. People have been burned by this before. They've been burned by Brexit and all sorts of other stuff. And that the expectations of voters is that nothing will get better, and that all you can do is try to manage as well as you can with what there is. We've got now the kind of centre-rightism that I think you probably get in America in 2008 when Obama came to power, but without any of the charisma. And I think you get it with Macron in France. The idea that government isn't really going to do anything. You might talk about hope and change, but it's not going to do anything. We all sort of know that. That's the kind of the implicit, the thing that's kind of implied. Instead, what government is going to do is sort of just about manage things. And it's a really, really bleak prospectus. And we have growing in the wings an increasingly vocal and popular far-right movement in Britain, and the auspices of the Reform Party. And they, Nigel Farage and Richard Tice, look at Donald Trump, they look at Marine Le Pen, they look at Giorgia Meloni and Viktor Orban, and people like that, and they say, that can happen here. And they're right, it can. So the Labour Party, when it wins its epic majority tomorrow, when it perhaps runs the Conservative Party down to double figures, perhaps the Conservative Party even ceases to become the official opposition, it won't be because they're offering a wonderful prospectus. It will be because they have simply taken upon themselves to do the kind of one nation conservatism, a slightly more benign or less malign version of conservatism that the Tories excelled in the mid-20th century, the likes of Macmillan or Heath. And that it will be something that will be well received by ordinary British people. The fact that Britain can't have anything better than that is really quite a tragedy, but there you go, that's the subject of a different video. So I'm going to stop now, but that gives you a kind of, if you're watching this from another part of the world, or you're engaging with British politics really for the first time, that gives you a kind of an overview, of course a very generalised one. So I'll put some links in the video below to other things I've done and some really interesting books on the subject that you can read. But yeah, hold on to your hats, guys, because Thursday is going to be a hell of a day. Thanks very much. All the best. Catch you on the next video.